Well, Don, you and I have been talking about WIPP and working on WIPP as an issue for many, many years now. You were just saying 30? You thought it was 30 years?
I think it's more than 30 actually, but maybe we should stop counting.
That might be best. So we came together today to talk about this article in the Albuquerque Journal, which says WIPP cleanup costs could rival 3 Mile Island. But since WIPP has fallen out of the news over the last couple of years, I thought maybe we should do a little background.
So WIPP is the acronym for the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, which was until 2014 the world's only operating deep geologic repository. In other words, it's a mine, mined out of salt, 2,150 feet below the surface in southeastern New Mexico, 26 miles east of Carlsbad. It was first thought about in the mid-1970s when there was thought that there needed to be a place to put nuclear waste from nuclear weapons. So this is not nuclear weapons themselves, this is waste from generating nuclear weapons. And the reason to put it deep underground is the waste, particularly plutonium, is dangerous for thousands of generations. So the thought was that if you need to have some place where something can be safe for thousands of years, a stable geologic underground place would be the most likely safe place to have it. So that was the idea for WIPP. It didn't open, it was highly controversial. You were very much involved in a lot of the debates and protests about that. So WIPP has always been controversial. Its name says Waste Isolation Pilot Plant. So most people understand pilot plant to be maybe the first small of several more to come. So that's been the concept. Unfortunately, it is still the only one. And so it started receiving waste in March of 1999 and received waste pretty continuously for almost 15 years until February 5th of 2014, when one of the worst things that can happen in any mine happened, which was there was a fire in the underground. So the 84 workers who were underground that day had to be evacuated.
Yeah, I understand one of those workers has a lawsuit against the department.
Well, the worker actually settled his lawsuit. He was permanently disabled. So he did what happens frequently in these kinds of situations. He agreed to an out-of-court settlement for an undisclosed amount of money, and with kind of a gag order that he's not really supposed to talk anymore about what happened. But he clearly was disabled and permanently disabled. So there were some other workers who were treated short-term for smoke inhalation, but there was this one worker who was, of course, severely damaged and disabled. As a result of that fire, that shut down the facility because, of course, fires are not supposed to happen in mines, so they had to, figure out what happened or try to figure out what happened, try to clean things up before they started taking any more waste down to the underground. So,
well, thank goodness for
yeah,
that the workers weren't underground when the big accident happened.
So then 9 days later, Valentine's Day 2014, just after 11 o'clock at night, the only operating underground radiation monitor alarmed.
Huh.
And there weren't any people down there, but the folks the 11 people on the surface and the person on the surface who was supposed to be paying attention to in the control room as to whether anything was happening said, maybe something is happening. So there wasn't anybody underground, but the Department of Energy and the contractor, Nuclear Waste Partnership, said at the time something happened in the underground, the alarm went off, but there was no release of radioactivity, and nobody on the surface was contaminated. And that was the story from late at night on 2014 going forward. In fact, so much so that on Saturday, February 15th, they allowed more than 100 workers to come to the site as if it was going to be a regular work day, which shouldn't have happened. And so ultimately, 9 of the workers who came on Saturday morning, in other words, several hours after the release started, so there were an additional 9 workers who came on Saturday morning who weren't even there anyways near the time of the accident, who ended up being radiologically contaminated, breathing in plutonium and americium that was released.
So it just seems like our big radioactive waste dump that our whole disposal program depends upon should have been more prepared for an accident than they were. Why do you think they were so unprepared?
Because they thought it would never happen. And they not only thought in their heads that it wouldn't happen, they designed the facility such that it wasn't prepared. And sort of the major indication of that that's still the case now that we're well after more than 2.5 years after this incident is that the facility is still contaminated, but it doesn't have adequate ventilation because they didn't build the ventilation system such that it could run as it normally did with filtering contamination so that contamination isn't just dispersed into the general environment. And so right now, because of the design, because they were sure there would never be a radiological release, they only designed this ventilation system to filter the air before it's released on the surface into the general environment to operate at 1/7 the flow rate that it normally would operate at. So there's now not enough air in the underground. There's not enough ventilation, there's not enough air in the underground, and so that both indicates 2 things. One is they didn't design the facility for there to be an accident, and 2, now that there's been an accident, the facility really can't operate. It wasn't designed, it's a salt mine, it wasn't designed to be cleaned up after an accident. So now if it operates anymore, it will have to be operating in a contaminated fashion, which it was never supposed to operate in. And whether it's operating or not, it doesn't have enough air in the underground. So those 2 things are problems. I think a couple other things were contributing factors. They'd been operating the facility for almost 15 years, so, people generally, if they've done things for a long time and think they know what they're doing, you get a little complacent, and there was some of that. And another thing that was happening is in October of 2012, 16 months before these things happened, they had changed contractors to operate the facility, and the new contractor was interested in making money and were cutting corners. I recognized significantly before 2014 and said so that the safety culture was declining because they were on the one hand getting too complacent, and on the other hand you had a new contractor who clearly, in my view, wasn't trying to be as safe as they were trying to be earlier on when the facility opened.
And it wasn't only WIPP that wasn't operating safely, it was also Los Alamos, right? I mean, you and I had worked on a permit for WIPP along with the State Environment Department. And when I read about the accident and then the reports on the accident, I realized that the permit wasn't being followed. And it didn't seem that either the Department of Energy, Los Alamos, or even the state's Environment Department seemed very interested in following the state's permit.
Yeah, unfortunately, there are two permits at issue. There was the Los Alamos permit that was being violated and the WIPP permit that was being violated. And specifically, the violations were that it's because this is dangerous waste, by definition, it's dangerous for a long time, thousands of generations literally. It was known that it needed to be handled carefully and you didn't want to have certain kinds of waste there. So both the Los Alamos waste and the WIPP permit prohibit chemical interactions, explosives, chemically reactive things. You don't want to have those things in WIPP because that is going to trigger fires, explosions, releases that, of course, you're never supposed to have. But both the Los Alamos permit and the WIPP permit were designed to specifically prohibit these kinds of things. They're explicitly, specifically prohibited in both permits. Yet Los Alamos, which had liquids and chemically reactive materials, knew they couldn't ship them to WIPP, but they kind of got short-circuited and wanted to do too fast with treating them to get rid of the liquids, to absorb the liquids, to take care of the problem so they wouldn't have this kind of thing. So they didn't follow their proper procedures, didn't follow the permit because they were in a hurry.
Because they were on a deadline, I remember, yes.
Yes, because the state of New Mexico, the Environment Department and the governor and Los Alamos had agreed that they were going to ship waste that were considered dangerous to be on the surface at Los Alamos to WIPP by June 30th of 2014. So they were in a big hurry to package this stuff up as quickly as possible at Los Alamos to ship it down to WIPP. And of course, by trying to go fast to meet the deadline, they both blew up WIPP and missed the deadline, and as the article talks about, have cost the taxpayers billions of dollars going forward. So, I mean, the kind of almost, not totally the worst of all worlds, because fortunately, if the Valentine's Day accident had happened with workers underground, you would have had very seriously injured, contaminated workers at the time. So it wasn't the worst possible scenario by any stretch of the imagination, but it was a very serious accident, and it's had major consequences because to meet a deadline, you actually don't meet the deadline. If you get in too big a hurry, you don't pay attention to your permits, you don't pay attention to safety.
Right. Hurrying up and radioactive waste don't seem to go together at all, do they?
Well, when you're talking about waste that's going to be around for thousands of generations, there's no way you really can speed up. And so you just need to understand it is so dangerous that you have to be slow and careful.
Right. Well, I sometimes frequent the Hazardous Waste Bureau, the New Mexico Environment's Hazardous Waste Bureau, and I used to go in there, and there used to be 2 floors of people that were talking with each other and full of conversation, and there would be people on both floors. And when I visited the Hazardous Waste Bureau recently, I come in and the ground floor is very quiet. There's hardly any people there. And there are people on the second floor, but it seems like that bureau, which oversees WIPP mostly, has been cut down. Have you experienced that?
Well, yes, there are fewer workers. There are really only currently 2 basically full-time people in the Environment Department to work on WIPP. For a lot of the time WIPP was open, there were 4. So that's, half the number of folks. So that's a significant problem. it bears pointing out that in theory, and sometimes the Department of Energy and some of the people who like to promote WIPP talk about, oh, we've got all these regulators and oversight folks, et cetera. Well, you have the Environment Department that is a regulator. You have the Federal Environmental Protection Agency that is a regulator a little bit. And you have the Mining Safety and Health Administration, the federal agency that is responsible for looking at mine safety. And when it comes to those three regulators, at the time of the accident, MSHA had not done MSHA, which was supposed to do underground inspection, safety inspections of the mine quarterly, had not been doing them. The Environment Department had shut down its monitoring, its air monitoring at the WIPP site. So it had no monitoring and no person there. And the EPA didn't have monitoring or people there. So yes, it is certainly true that the oversight and regulation that was supposed to happen was not happening. So you may say, well, how did we know that something happened? Because we and other people designed this to be a redundant system, not wanting this kind of lax regulation to happen, but wanting to have some hopeful fail-safes there. So in addition, there is a non-regulatory group called the Carlsbad Environmental Monitoring and Research Center that is administratively part of New Mexico State. It's funded by DOE to do monitoring, and so it had done monitoring at the WIPP site from before WIPP opened up until today, but certainly, so it was their monitoring on February 19th that actually first detected that there had been a release into the environment. The Department of Energy said nobody was contaminated, the environment wasn't contaminated, the workers weren't contaminated. So it wasn't until after CMERC identified that there was contamination that then the workers got further examined to figure out that they were contaminated. So in some cases, it was more than 2 months after they were contaminated before the workers were even told that they were contaminated. So again, this goes back to the lack, rather there being too much oversight and too much regulation, there actually wasn't enough oversight and regulation in practice.
Well, oftentimes people will talk about how regulation slows you down and it's costly, but I just can't help thinking that if there had been someone in that room at Los Alamos and people at WIPP that were regulating, maybe this wouldn't have happened. And that $2 billion could have been saved and used for education or other things that we really need. And I think it's a misunderstanding that regulation is in our way somehow, an obstacle in our way.
Well, I think the WIPP case shows that it's, especially in the WIPP case, you are absolutely correct. If there would have been better regulation and better compliance with the permits at Los Alamos and at WIPP, this kind of thing could have been avoided. One of the reasons that you and I and other people spent literally days and days and days.
Wasn't it about a month?
But in the 1990s, before WIPP opened, to get the original permit, and there were major fights. The Department of Energy thought we were being too stringent. We in the Environment Department were being too stringent in terms of some of the provisions in the original permit. And then the 10-year renewal that you're talking about, again, they were trying to have less restrictive provisions in the permit, and so that was highly contentious as well. But we knew that it was dangerous. Everybody gives lip service to the idea it's dangerous waste in a dangerous facility, but therefore you have to be very cautious. And if the provisions of the permit had, both the Los Alamos and the WIPP permit had been adhered to, this kind of event would not have happened. or both events would not have happened. But in the practical matter, the permits require compliance on the part of DOE and the contractor. They, rather than fighting the provisions of the permit, ought to be saying, yeah, we are going to meet and exceed those provisions, and the regulators are going to make sure that that happens. And in this case, all of that fell down. DOE wasn't doing an adequate job of overseeing their contractor. The contractor, who gets paid over $150 million a year to operate the facility, wasn't doing its job correctly. The folks at Los Alamos, who were getting paid to handle the waste and prepare it, didn't do their job. And then the various regulators, the Environment Department and EPA specifically, weren't doing their job, and MSHA wasn't doing its job well enough in terms of the mine inspection, and so these kind of events happen.
So it seems to me that things really haven't changed that much, because Secretary Moniz put a deadline now on opening WIPP, and it's unclear whether WIPP is going to be ready to be opened. I mean, aren't a lot of the workers still dressed in, completely suited up like Ebola workers at this point?
Yes, that's all true. The Secretary Moniz, when he came to Carlsbad a few months after the WIPP accident, said, you know, his goal was to get WIPP safely reopened, but reopened before he leaves office. And because he's part of the Obama administration, he leaves office in January of 2017. So originally, way back in September of 2014, they said WIPP would reopen by March of 2016. Well, finally, during 2015, they finally acknowledged the fact that that was a very unrealistic date. They weren't going to meet that. And so they then have pushed back the date until the current proposed date, which is December 2016, which, as you precisely said, is while Secretary Moniz is still there. Facility is still not going to be ready to operate then. They should be abandoning that date. If they do try to reopen in December or are capable of reopening in some extent, I think it will be highly dangerous because A, as we've talked about, there's not enough ventilation. B, because the only places that are mined out in the underground to put waste in are contaminated. You have to have, you know, these suits on, which again, the workers are being retrained to use them, but for 15 years, they never used any of those kinds of things. They were handling the waste in their shirt sleeves, just, you know, normal civilian clothes. And so it's very difficult in any mine to operate in that kind of, you know, uniform. If health workers dealing with Ebola victims, you know, they can only be in the suits for a short period of time, and they have to get in and out of them very carefully, and they're hot and sweaty and difficult to work in. You can't, you know, you're not nearly as dexterous, et cetera. Well, that's true in the underground, and you're hauling around heavy containers of nuclear waste. So it's not a safe environment. The Department of Energy says that they don't know how long it will take and they don't know how much it will cost to sort of redo the ventilation system to get it back to the kind of airflow it was beforehand. But their current estimates are that that won't happen until at least 2021. So it would seem to me that if safety first is the case, which it should be, that they wouldn't be talking about reopening the facility until 2021 when they have adequate ventilation, et cetera. But because of deadlines, because of wanting to hurry up, they don't want to do that. I think they do need to continue to think about that, and I think as you and I and other people are kind of urging them to back off of this December date and to not think about reopening, I think, you know, the government needs to take that more seriously.
Right. It seems to me that we're in the same situation that we were in when the drum blew and caused this $2 billion problem. We're up against a deadline. and safety is not coming first. And, there was also, I remember, some contamination of the environment. And it's quite possible that if there are more mistakes, that there could be more contamination. And I know we both know people in southeastern New Mexico. Some of them have children and grandchildren, and they're very concerned about this situation. I just hope that the Department of Energy comes to their senses and puts safety first. And I feel like we all deserve that. The other thing is this lack of transparency. I certainly never heard that it was going to cost $2 billion to clean up WIPP, and I'm sure you didn't either.
Well, we don't really know how much it's going to cost. So what we know so far is the contractor that didn't operate the facility safely, Nuclear Waste Partnership, has been rewarded for not operating it safely by being given $300 million more so far in their contract. So rather than being penalized, they're obviously being rewarded. So we know that there's $300 million more that is being spent. We know that, as I said, doing the new exhaust shaft ventilation system is going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars more. We know that if it does reopen, so the facility will have been shut down for 3 years, so that at least extends the life of the facility for 3 more years. And in fact, because they're trying to reopen before they're ready to reopen, that they would have to only handle a smaller amount of waste than normally, that's going to extend the life. In fact, they're formally talking about the lifetime of WIPP, which used to be, it was going to be filled up and closed up by 2025. They're now talking 2050. So if that happens, 25 extra years at a minimum of $200 million a year, that's $5 billion more that it's going to cost, just in addition to this sort of what they're calling recovery from it. So the ultimate costs of the accident are going to be more than what currently looks like it's a couple of $2 billion, but it almost certainly will be a lot more than that, which of course begs the question, is that throwing good money after bad? WIPP is a pilot plant. There are supposed to be other repositories. They don't yet exist, but there are supposed to be other repositories. So another option that could have and should have been considered, and should still be considered, is these other repositories down the line that are supposed to be uncontaminated and operate in an uncontaminated way. The remaining waste that's supposed to come to WIPP could stay where it is at various places around the country until it could go to these other repositories. So the consideration of both cost and safety of whether WIPP should reopen should be looked at.
That's right. It's something like a cost-risk-benefit analysis, and then something that would tell us how much it would cost to build a new repository. I mean, are we throwing good money after bad here, or not? We don't really know, because we've never seen any figures like that.
Well, and as you said, we haven't gone through the kind of public process that should have happened. The Department of Energy, folks in Carlsbad, the contractors, and for that matter, the regulators, and the government officials should be saying, let's have this conversation and, look at these things and see what should happen and could happen and what the various pros and cons of different things are. That hasn't happened yet. It's still not too late to do that. And that's the kind of thing that anybody who's interested in getting involved, I would encourage them to do, to contact the Department of Energy, contact your elected officials and say, we should have safety first, and we should know that it's whether it's safe to reopen, and if it's not safe to reopen, what the alternatives really are. So those are the kinds of things I'd like for people to think about.
Right, and so that we can see all the factors involved, the risk to the workers, the cost of another facility versus trying to keep this very limping facility open. Yes, I think the public deserves that kind of information.
Okay, well, hopefully we've helped give them some of that. So nice talking to you again.
Nice talking with you, Don. Don has worked with Southwest Research and Information Center for how many years now?
41.
41. And your title is?
Director of the Nuclear Waste Program.
Right. And I'm Janet Greenwald. I'm co-coordinator of Citizens for Alternatives to Radioactive Dumping, which is an old grassroots organization. It's statewide and mostly volunteer. Thank you for your attention to this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much.